So welcome to the Beginner Brewer's first webinar. I'm really excited to be sharing all this with you. It'll be one of many, I think, and I'm really excited to be able to share with you the passion I have for home brewing and for brewing beer in general. So today, as I said in my Facebook post, it's really an introduction to beginning brewing. So if you're a veteran brewer, maybe some of this will be very old news to you, but I think it's really important to start somewhere with this journey. And so I hope that many of you are starting right now, and many people are kind of getting into the hobby now because of various reasons, will find this helpful. Let me just quickly tell you a little bit about me so that you know that I'm not some sort of lunatic. I've been brewing since 2003. I'm the creator of the Beginner Brewer website. I'm also a columnist for Untitled magazine, which I would really recommend all of you subscribing to. You can go and get the free winter edition just to see what it's like. I really think it's a nice magazine. I'm also a sensory analyst, CBL accredited, which means I can judge beer, generally okay. And I also consult in the craft beer industry for recipe formulation, process, and so on. Okay, so hopefully I can bring some of this experience to bear, but it's important also to note that I'm still making mistakes. I'm still learning in this wonderful hobby of brewing. What are we going to do today? So really what I want to get across today is two things. First, that brewing is maybe simpler than you may have imagined. And secondly, that it is something which you can learn more and more about and become more complex about as you go along. But you don't have to start at the most complicated part of this whole thing. So relax and brew some beer. Very important, right? I think that when I help new brewers brew, and I've taught a lot of brew schools, and I will be teaching some more in the future soon, albeit virtually, it's important for me to try and relax people because I think they get a little bit upset, or they get a bit anxious. They think, everything I do can be a mistake, it can ruin the beer. But that's not really the case. The fact of the matter is that, beer wants to be made. That's what I always tell people when I do a brew school. Beer wants to be made. What do I mean by that? Well, beer is pretty much the most ancient commercially produced beverage ever in humanity's history. There are beer recipes to be found on the walls of ancient Sumerian tombs, and that was like, 4000 BC. So if those ancient people who did not have refrigeration and who did not have the internet could make pretty decent beer, you can too. And I think that's really important to know. Beer can almost be made accidentally, and in fact, that's probably how it started. There's a couple of malted grains being put into water and be left to ferment. You'll get beer. So beer doesn't have to be complicated. It can almost be accidentally created. Obviously, it won't necessarily be the best beer you'll ever taste, and so that's why we introduce modern technology, modern knowledge of science, and brewing science into the process to make even better beer. But never ever forget that beer wants to be made. And I hope to illustrate that as I go along today and explain the process to you. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take you through how beer is made. So I'm using some illustrations you'll see shortly of sort of large brewing processes. But the fact of the matter is, if you do home brewing, you will use very much the same kind of process, albeit in a different way and using different equipment. Get started. I think it's important to understand the basic process of how beer is being made in any process, but I will touch on how home brewing differs from commercial brewing. And I think one of the reasons I want to take people through this is often when you start out in this hobby, there's no one to tell you that. You've kind of got to pick it up as you go along, or you feel like it's too stupid a question to ask, and so you never ask it, and then you never really know what's going on. So often when you start in brewing, it almost feels like you're walking through a very dark room, and you're getting directions from whatever kit maybe you bought or something. It's telling you to turn left and to turn right, but you're not really sure what the room looks like. You just know, I'm following these instructions, and I hope like hell I'm going to get to the other side. And I hope to help you understand why you do the things you do as you brew beer. And I'm hopefully also going to give you some terminology which you'll hear people drop every now and again. It's not meant to confuse you. Like any hobby, we have some jargon. So I'll point that out as we go along. So let's get started. So how is beer made? Firstly, barley is malted. That means that we take barley grains, sometimes other grains, and we partly germinate it. So just like when you were at school, if you can remember that far back, and you did those experiments with seeds where you grew them in cotton wool and you watered them and they started germinating, this is pretty much what you do with barley. But we stop the germination short of growing an actual plant, and that's called the malting process. What that does is it starts plumping up that grain and creating the starches, which will eventually be turned into beer. So what do you do after that? So brewers generally do not malt their own grains anymore. That's done by brewing wizards called maltsters who have dark and secret ways. But once we get that barley, we would mash it. So this is where the brewing process starts. You may have heard the term mashing or mashing in. This is what we do. So essentially, you're going to be creating a kind of a grain porridge. And you can see that it ranges quite widely depending on what you're trying to do. But generally, if you're doing a simple all-grain brew process, you will be steeping or creating that porridge at about 66.7 degrees Celsius. But there are other temperatures also, but I'm not going to try and confuse you with that today. That'll be the topic maybe of a future webinar. And when we mash, we do so for a certain amount of time, usually about 75 minutes to an hour. What does that do? Well, when you mash, and this is why I always say that, beer wants to be made. There are natural enzymes to be found in barley grains, which convert starch into sugar. So that plump starch, which was formed during the malting process, gets slowly converted into sugars through enzymatic action. And because you're heating it and you're adding water, it's the perfect environment for enzymes to operate. So you don't have to add anything. That's actually what's so magical about beer. It just wants to be made. And that's probably how beer was made accidentally in the first place, is someone must have left some grains in water on a warm day maybe. The enzymes started naturally mashing those grains, creating sugars. Maybe they tasted it and realized, hey, this is sweet stuff. What's going on? That's really how it works. So it's a very natural process, which is almost inevitable. So keep that in mind. It's not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. It wants to be made. When we mash the grains and we produce this sort of sweet liquid, we call it something else, by the way. It's called wort, spelled W-O-R-T, wort. And that liquid is going to eventually be turned into beer. Then we lauter it. So lautering is a process by which we wash the sugars free of the grain. So you're going to have a lot of grains in a mash. So it's going to be a grain bed which is formed. And you want to wash those sugars free of the grain bed through lautering. And you do that at a higher temperature usually, about 76 to 80 degrees Celsius. And then you recirculate. And by recirculating it, you're really creating a much clearer beer. And the grain bed itself almost acts as a filter in any kind of mashing process, which again just shows you that, it's almost as though all the processes and stuff just support the natural process of beer wanting to be made. Okay, so lautering. And if you're an all-grain brewer, this is where you start. You will use the raw ingredients of malted barley, and you will mash them, you will lauter them in some way or another, and there are many different ways of doing so, and that's where you start with your brewing process. Obviously, if you start here at the very beginning, it means you've got way more control over what's going to happen. Alternatively, another way of seeing it is you've got way more opportunities to screw things up, and it makes it a little bit more complicated, more difficult. So there are benefits and costs to it. I don't normally advise people to start with all-grain brewing. I think it introduces too many variables without all the benefits which you may imagine. I'll let you know where I think you should start in a little while. So now that we've lautered it, we've washed clear the wort of the grains, where does that go? Well, now you got to boil this stuff. And this is a very, very complicated illustration of a commercial kettle with a big chimney going out of it. Homebrewers generally use a pot, right? You probably use a stock pot of some kind with nice tall walls. And this also explains, by the way, why beer was considered a very safe thing to drink back in the old days. That those Sumerians, the 4,000-year-old beer, was way better to drink than water, which probably would make you sick. And still to this day, I think, beer is a very healthy drink, obviously. It's got a lot of minerals and vitamins, which you need. And boiling it really serves many different purposes, by the way. It sterilizes it, obviously, but it concentrates flavors, and it serves a lot of really important purposes to making beer. Okay. This is also, by the way, where you add hops and other ingredients, which will flavor the beer. Wort is incredibly sweet stuff. If you've ever tasted it, you realize how sweet that can be. Way too sweet for beer. And this is already where beer starts being made, and why beer tastes the way it does, is you're trying to balance that sweetness with bitterness from things like hops and other ingredients. Okay. And then you whirlpool, right? So whirlpool is a process where you actually concentrate all the stuff left over from the boil to further clarify your beer. It's got some other functions as well. And this is really where extract brewing starts. And when I say extract brewing, I mean when you use extracts with specialty grains. And this is a really good place to start for beginning brewing. It's different from kit brewing, which I'm not too fond of, and I'll show you why I'm not too fond of in a little while. But extract brewing is a very nice alternative. It's very simple. It's almost as simple as kit brewing. In fact, I sometimes think it's more simple. And the advantage of that is that you learn a lot about the brewing process, because you can see you're here in this, the boil process. So the mashing is not something which extract brewers have to worry about. The wort is already formed for you through extract. And I would advise you to use dried malt extract for various reasons. The main one being it's mostly fresh. It's made in very large quantities here in South Africa. So you're always assured of a fresh product. And it's reasonably easy to get hold of. It's not that expensive. And so that's a really good product made from mashing barley. So that work is done for you as an extract brewer, which is nice. It means that all those variables are removed. You're assured of a good quality product. And then you can start using extract at this process where you're boiling, you're adding ingredients and so forth. And it teaches you a lot of really important principles of brewing. So that's where extract brewing starts. What happens after whirlpooling? Well, we have to chill the wort. Okay, we have to chill it out to about 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. Why is that? Well, we're trying to now prepare the wort for yeast. And yeast cannot operate at high temperatures. In fact, yeast will just sort of denature or die basically at high temperatures. So we have to chill the wort quite rapidly. The more rapid you chill it, the better usually, because there's some clarity issues which you can take care of if you do that. And also flavor stability, which is assured if you chill it very quickly. And this is sort of where kit brewing starts. So if you have done some kit brews, and I don't want to disparage kit brewing, because a lot of people start that way. I started that way a long time ago. And it wasn't, it was fun. But the reason I don't like kit brewing is so much of the process of making beer has already been done by the time you reach this stage. The whole hot process, which I showed on the previous slide, you have no involvement in whatsoever. I mean, sure, you're adding boiling water to the kit and you're mixing it up, but that's just really so that you can, add the syrups and so on to the kit and then stick it in the fermenter. But you have almost no control over what beer you're producing. It's all up to the kit. In fact, that's sort of the selling point of a kit, is it's all done for you. It's essentially beer, just add water. But I don't think that's much fun. I don't think you have nearly enough control over what you produce. There's some other things which I don't like too much about kits. There are some freshness issues sometimes because it's shipped from overseas usually. But even though that's less of a problem nowadays, I think the main disadvantage of a kit is it doesn't really teach you anything about brewing beer. You are really literally following the instructions to walk through that dark room, but you don't really know why you're doing it. And a lot of the things you can learn about making really excellent beer can only be taught in that previous process I showed you, and not in this process. Be that as it may, you at least learn a little bit about fermentation when you use kit brewing, so that's good. But really, given the simplicity of using extracts with specialty grains, I'd really recommend you going for that if you haven't started brewing yet. It's as simple. It's a little bit more variables to take into account, but it's not complicated. And what the advantages are massive. You can access almost any style of beer. In kit brewing, you are limited to what kits are available. So if you're interested in making a quadruple Belgian ale, and there's no kit available for it, well, you're out of luck. But in extract brewing, you can do that. Okay, so the variety of beers you're able to access is just massive. Okay. By the way, just as we go along, don't hesitate to drop some questions in the chat. I really would like to answer those questions for you at the end of the webinar. So don't hesitate to drop some questions in the chat for me. Right, after we chill wort, it's fermented. So ales generally ferment at about 16 to 22 degrees Celsius, lagers at a much lower temperature, and that can take anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks. Lagers generally take longer because of a lower temperature. Everything is slower at lower temperature, whereas everything is much faster at higher temperatures, right? So normal laws of thermodynamics here. And that's where we add the yeast. Yeast is added at this stage when the wort is now nicely chilled. And a lot of what you do as a brewer really is to try and create a very nice environment for the yeast to work. It's often said that, brewers don't make beer, yeast makes beer. And that's kind of true. We are just trying to create the conditions of proper yeast fermentation. And you'll notice that if you read some of the articles on my blog, beginnerbrewer.com, and other articles in other places, a lot of times when beer goes south and when it goes wrong, a common culprit is what you often find people writing about is yeast health. So you'll see that is at the core of many different issues of not brewing good beer. And thanks so much for the questions you're posting. I'm definitely going to address them as at the end of the show. So thanks a lot for that. Okay, what happens after fermentation? After that process, we condition and carbonate the beer, and then we package the beer. Okay, and conditioning and carbonating is quite quick, usually because it's force carbonated in commercial breweries. In home brewing, you're not often going to force carbonate. You're going to actually create natural carbonation. So often in home brewing, these two processes are reversed. So we tend to package the beer first, we bottle the beer, and because we're adding a little bit of sugar there, and there's still yeast left in the beer, the yeast and sugar will interact and create carbonation for us in the bottle. So that carbonation process is actually put to the end in home brewing. So that's a major difference between what home brewers do and what commercial brewers do. The cool part of this process I've just shown you is this is really the essence of making beer for both the craft breweries you like, if you go to Jack Black or Devil's Peak or wherever, this is exactly the process they follow. And this is exactly the kind of process you will follow as a home brewer. And again, that's one of the other reasons I feel it's important to start with extract brewing, or if you want to be adventurous, you can start with all grain brewing. But skip over the kit thing. I'm not a big supporter of that because you're really not going to learn much by doing so. Okay, let's move on. Just to recap. So there are two sides of the brewing process that I've just shown you. There is the hot and the cold side. And you often hear people talk about hot side brewing, cold side brewing. That's what they're talking about. So hot side brewing is mashing. Mentioned that. You can mash grains. You can sometimes even put hops in that process as well. Then sparging and lautering. So lautering is the main process of releasing it. Sparging is when you wash the grains, and release the sugary wort. And then boiling. And as I said, boiling has more than just sterilization going for it. It concentrates malt flavor. It adds the hop bitterness and other flavors. And if you add any other flavors, which through adjuncts, this is where you do that. And also boiling helps clarify beer. So it's something called a hot break. And you really sort of denaturing proteins, which are naturally found in grains and other plant materials like hops, and it helps clarify the beer through boiling. So often kit beers are a little bit hazy as a result of not boiling anything. And that's why. I love clear beer. It's something I can talk about. I can probably do an entire webinar on clear beer, and maybe I should. But crystal clear beer is a thing of joy. And don't believe people when they say, oh, it's craft beer, it must be hazy or milky. It shouldn't be. There are styles of beer which can be milky and hazy. Most beers need to be clear. Okay. So don't believe that if you hear it thrown around. And then the cold side is really where we start making beer through yeast. And the yeast is really converting that sugar which you've created, either through use of extract or through use of mashing your own grains. It's eating up that sugar, and it's producing two things. Producing alcohol, obviously very important, right, for beer, and it's producing flavor compounds as a result, which will flavor the beer, and it's producing CO2, which helps us carbonate the beer eventually. And this cold side is really where you have to be careful with sanitization. Really, really careful. You'll hear that another thing a lot of brewers say is that brewing is about 70% sanitization and cleaning. It is kind of like that. It's not always that glamorous. You do have to use a bit of elbow grease, and be very cautious about sanitization. So even though beer wants to be made, and you can even make it accidentally, making really excellent beer does require a little bit more care and attention for things like sanitization. So what makes beer taste like beer? I thought this was an important thing to cover today, because I think often not even experienced brewers, which I've spoken to, always are very sure about why beer tastes the way it does. And if you can start understanding that, you can start making better beer. And also it'll clue you in, if you're new to this hobby, about what the different ingredients do. Okay. So there's a couple of ingredients really important, barley being one. Okay, so it's the beer grain. Most beers are made out of it. It doesn't have to be barley, but it usually is. And here we have the malting process. You usually malt it, but it doesn't have to be in some cases. And there are two main classes of barley. So you've got base grains and specialty grains. So base grains are always malted, and that's where you get your primary sugars from, which create the beer. Specialty malts are kiln, stewed, roasted, or all three, and they can give different flavors to beer. So if you're going to be an extract brewer to begin with and use specialty grains, you're going to be using these malts especially to create some of these flavors over here. So you can create all sorts of flavors. So if you drink a beer and you taste that biscuity flavor or honeyed flavor or chocolate flavors even, some of the beers really taste very chocolatey, your porters and your stouts, even smoky, right? You get smoked beers. Drayman Brewery in Pretoria makes an excellent smoked beer called Jolly Monk. And that comes from malts which actually were smoked in the smoking process to create that flavor. And a lot of your specialty malts, which extract brewers like using, are called crystal malts or caramel malts because they taste caramel-like or toffee-like. So all these flavors are coming from your barley. Okay, the next one to make beer what it is hops, right? Very, very important. It's my favorite ingredient in beer, really. I'm a bit of a hophead. I love very hoppy beers. And there are really hundreds of different varieties, hundreds and hundreds. And they're more being sort of bred every year. And there are two main classes of hops. So you get bittering hops, which is used to, as it says, bitter the beer out. So remember that wort is really, really sweet. So you need to balance it out with bittering. And that's what these kind of hops do. And then you have low alpha acid hops, which are flavor and aroma hops. And that creates more flavor. And you can really manipulate what hops contributes to your beer through the temperature at which you use it. So if you boil hops, it will do a different thing to your beer than if you use it in the fermentation process, which is cold. Then it will add different kinds of flavor. And also the duration of boiling. Generally speaking, the longer you boil hops for, the more bitterness you extract from it. So if you start your boil and put some hops in, it's going to be very bitter. If you add your hops later in the boil, it'll produce more flavor and less bitterness. Okay. And it can really be added at any stage of the brewing process. And one of the fun parts of being a home brewer is to experiment with different additions of hops. You know, some brewers experiment with adding it in the mash even. You can do dry hopping, which is when you add hops to the fermenter. It's called dry hopping simply because you're using the cold process. It doesn't mean that the hop stage is dry. I'm not really sure why they call it dry hopping. It's a bit confusing. And here are some of the flavors you can get from hops. This is just a sample, but it's the main flavors of what hops can produce. So you can get anything from a floral to a citrus to spicy flavors to pine and grassy flavors, dank flavors. Turns out that the closest relative in the plant kingdom to hops happens to be marijuana. That's why it has that flavor sometimes. So you can have a tremendous range of flavors which you can add to your beer through additions of hops. Again, I know it's starting to sound even to me that I'm sort of being a little bit negative about kit brewing, be that as it may. But the problem with kit brewing is often these kits are pre-hopped. So they add hop extract to the syrups which you use, the extracts. So you have no control over the hops you're adding. Where if you just push that process back a little bit and do extract brewing with specialty malts, you can add your own hops in the boil. Much more fun. It's nice to work with hops, experiment with hops, and that's really, for me, a critical process of brewing. Yeast, very important. Okay, so many people don't understand this, but yeast is an incredibly important part of beer. I think one of the reasons we sometimes forget about it is it's so tiny, right? In any kind of brewing process at home, you usually have a little packet of dry yeast. It seems almost immaterial to the process. You know you've got to add it to the wort to create beer, but it doesn't seem very important. But it turns out that yeast can account for up to 70% of beer flavor. Okay, that's tremendous. Which is why you need to keep yeast happy. Otherwise, you're not going to have great beer. There are two main classes: lager, Saccharomyces pastorianus, and ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And those are the two main yeasts which are cultivated throughout the world to produce beer. And they really work differently at different temperatures. So lager yeast has been bred to work at lower temperatures very, very well, whereas ale yeast is modified and bred to be very effective at higher room temperatures. Okay. And you get dried or liquid variants. Mostly homebrewers start with dry yeast. It's easier to use, much less trouble in getting it started. But you get many more liquid varieties of yeast. So dry yeast is improving every year. There's more and more varieties, but the amount of yeast you can get in liquid form just sort of is massive. And it's a really important part of making beer, because you've got to match the yeast to the style of beer you create. And because yeast contributes so much flavor to beer, you can really manipulate beer's flavors and create different styles through the use of yeast. In fact, you can brew exactly the same beer, and at the point of adding yeast, if you add two different yeasts to that beer, so if you split your brew, and I would actually encourage you to do so, split your brew and add two different kinds of yeast to these two batches, you will end up with a very different beer, depending obviously on the yeast you use. But that's actually quite remarkable. And so yeast, do not forget the importance of yeast, please. The flavors yeast produces for beer are varied and many, from the spicy sort of clove-like flavors of wheat beers that comes from the wheat yeast, which is the yeast which is used for wheat beer rather. You can get funky flavors, barnyard flavors, from some of those Belgian beers you may have tried. That's all from the yeast, right? And that's a sort of a cultivated form of wild yeast, which you often use in Belgian beers. Fruity flavors, banana flavors, that sort of thing comes from yeast. You may have had some English ales which have a butterscotch or a creamy flavor. That comes from yeast. It can even impart sort of woody flavors. And then the neutral, the clean, the crispness of a beer comes from yeast as well. Often when we do ales, we will use American ale yeast, which has that sort of crisp quality. Your lager yeast tend to have a crisp finish. It creates that crisp finish through alcohol. And yeast obviously produces the alcohol in beer, and alcohol has a flavor, right? It has a warming flavor. It has a boozy flavor. It has a dry palate kind of feel. So if you like a dry finish in a beer, it means that you like a beer with a little bit more alcohol in it. So yeast is involved in all these processes. Super important. Cannot overemphasize it enough. Obviously, water. It's the most, it's sort of 90% of what beer is all about. And you can get into this sort of rabbit hole very easily. I wouldn't recommend it if you're starting out. But really, if you make sure that your water is clean, and most importantly, devoid of chlorine and chloramine. So here in South Africa, a lot of chloramine is added into our water, supplied by the municipalities and Rand Water and so on. That's a good thing because it does kill bacteria. So we have very clean water in that sense. But unfortunately, chloramine doesn't do well with beer, and it creates a lot of off flavors, which wouldn't be nice. And so you've got to remove that somehow if you're going to use, municipality water. And the way to do that is through a carbon filter. Okay, so you can filter it through sort of a Brita filter, or you get those bigger filters you can directly attach to your taps. And carbon is very good at removing chloramine. Boiling is not that effective, by the way, because chloramine actually is stable at high temperatures, unlike chlorine. And then the hardness and softness affects your beer, so you will know whether your water is hard or soft, and that will affect beer a little bit differently. Generally, harder waters are good for making hoppier, bitter beers than softer waters, but that's, it's pretty subtle. And the water produces a lot of, or has a lot of minerals, which will help you keep yeast healthy. Okay, so that is why reverse osmosis water is not really recommended for beginning brewing, because there is no mineral in RA water. It's all removed. So those vital minerals and so on, which you find in normal water, are not there. And so yeast will not do that well. And it won't taste very nice as well, because a lot of the taste factors are missing. And so RA water, not recommended. You can build your own water, but that's pretty advanced. So you can use RA, and some breweries do that. They use RA water and then build their own water through adding minerals and salts and so on to the water to have the profile they want. It's complicated though. My recommendation to you is to rather use the water you have and see which beers you can make really well using that water. Boral water, obviously, if it's clean and drinkable, you can use that. Just be sure to, maybe if you can, test your water. I mean, I've seen a lot of people use, when they test their boral water, it's less clean than they thought. So it's not always assured, because there's so much pollution and, seeping into groundwater and so on. So you're not always 100% assured of clean water. But if you've been drinking a boral water for years and you haven't grown a third eye yet, you should be okay. Or, of course, the more expensive is you can use mineral water. Okay, so many brewers use that. They buy a couple of liters of mineral water, which does not have chloramine in it. And then the fifth ingredient of beer is all the other stuff. All the other stuff you can add to beer. You may have, guessed that I'm not a big supporter of the Reinheitsgebot, which is an ancient, outmoded law which Germany had in the Middle Ages, which said you're not allowed to add anything other than barley and water to beer and hops. They didn't know about the existence of yeast, so they didn't include that, but they later on did. But really, beer is a much more diverse drink than just that. You can add almost anything to beer. In fact, if you're into extreme brewing and recreating ancient recipes and so on, you will eventually start adding other stuff to beer, and it's fun. And here are just a small sample of the things you can add. Other grains, right? So a lot of people use any one of these grains and more in either mashing or adding it as a specialty grain. Rye beers are very nice. I've made a few myself over the years. I really enjoy rye beers. You can add fruits, right? Fruit beer. Some of you may have had the Belgian Krieks, which is a fruit beer. You can add nuts, although that's very difficult. If you make a good nut beer, you are a truly skilled brewer, because nuts have oils in them which are very difficult to work with. You can add vegetables in beer. You may have had a pumpkin beer, or sort of a festive autumn beer which has pumpkin in it before. That's a good example of a vegetable beer. Herbs and spices. Any herb, any spice which you use in cooking, you can use in beer. About a year or so ago, I made one of the best beers I've ever made, which was a Saison style beer, which I added basil to. I would never have thought basil would work in a beer, but it did in this one. Sugars, syrups, and honey. And they can add flavor. So honey can definitely add a honey flavor to beer. And sugars can also make your beer drier, higher in alcohol. So a lot of your Belgian beers include that idea of adding sugars, and so on. And wood, right? You can age beer in wood, but barrels are really expensive. So unless you're lucky enough to have a few tucked away, you can use chips or staves in your fermenter to add that wood character to beer. So a lot of your English ales, for instance, really benefit from that, or your porters, you can age them in whiskey barrels, for instance. That's fantastic. And tea, coffee, and wine, right? There are hybrid beers available where you add wine and beer together. I've made some coffee porters in the past, which weren't too bad. So really, you are limited only by your imagination. It's really, and where in the cycle you add, right? As an example, if you add fruit to the boil, it will create a different tasting beer than if you added fruit to the fermenter, right? So you can just sort of use your own logical thinking here, and very much similar to cooking. It's worth experimenting. Okay, so that is the reason beer tastes the way it does. So I've just managed to get us in time. And I'm happy to say that we've got quite a bit of time left for questions, and I hope to address that. But I hope that I've given you some handle on this dark room, right? I hope that the light's switched on now. You kind of know why these things happen the way they do. I hope that you're also encouraged to try your hand at extract brewing with specialty grains if you're just starting out. If you've already tried that or you've done a lot of kit brewing, I would still recommend you try that. But you can also do all grain brewing. And on the Beginner Brewer website, which you can see the address here, you'll see a lot of articles on that, which I've written over the years. And also feel free to email me at the email address here for any questions you may have. But I'm going to try and address some of the questions which people have asked throughout the webinar. Thanks for that, by the way. I really appreciate it. And really, there are no stupid questions in brewing. You may think so, but really there aren't. So I'm going to start at the top. First question is how to make gluten-free beers. Well, certain grains don't contain gluten. So although it was rare, it's more common now. And sorghum is the most used grain for creating gluten-free beers. So you can use sorghum in much the same way as barley. You can mash it and so forth to create very nice sorghum beers. I recently took part in the Africa Cup beer judging competition. I was a beer judge there, and we tasted some excellent sorghum beers made from around Africa and South Africa. And sorghum beers can taste exactly like, you know, the beers you're used to. It doesn't necessarily taste like the traditional sorghum beers, which is found in South Africa. That is a very nice beer to have, and it's a bit of an acquired taste, but you can also use sorghum to create your more sort of Western style of beers as well. Okay. So and the next question, I hope that's answered your question. It's a topic in and of itself, but you can definitely make gluten-free beer. Which beers do brewers in South Africa prefer, ale, lager, and why? Okay. I don't know. You know, I'm involved in marketing in the beer industry as well, and I've consulted with a lot of breweries around that. My personal opinion is there's not enough data, market research, to suggest that South Africans necessarily prefer one or the other. I think sometimes the assumption is made incorrectly that, you know, South Africans only drink lagers and they will never be able to drink nice fruity ales or very hoppy IPAs and so on. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I think the jury's still out for that. And as you start your journey in homebrewing, you'll see that, you know, the variety of beer styles which is available to you is just massive, and you'll find your own styles that you'll enjoy. Next question, how possible is contamination after boiling? Well, that's really where the risk is of contamination. As soon as your wort reaches around 60 degrees Celsius, it is possible to maintain bacterial life. So there are quite a few bacteria which can infect beer, and also wild yeast. So wild yeast is just drifting around everywhere. It's often found on the fur of your pets. I've got cats, so I'm always very careful to keep them out of my brewing location when I brew. So, you know, as soon as your wort is less than 60 degrees Celsius, it can be contaminated. So that's why you need to sterilize everything which will be touching cooled wort, because that's where much of the contamination takes place. Just as a note, if you're new to this and you may be worried, like, you know, Marcel is saying, you know, beer can be infected, does that mean I can make something which can kill me? No, you cannot. Okay, the infections which beer are vulnerable to will only make beer taste really bad. And the off flavors in beer is a topic which you'll find some articles on beginnerbrewer.com. But really, all you can do, the worst you can do is make undrinkable beer. It'll be so bad sometimes that you know that something is wrong and you won't want to drink it. Some infections are more subtle. It won't make you ill. It just tastes really bad. So beer is very safe, right? I mean, people made it, you know, thousands of years ago. Where you've seen articles in the media, by the way, of people killing themselves with homebrew, that's not beer. That's when people make, you know, jailhouse beer, where it's sort of, they're trying to filter out methylated spirits, and, you know, it's like pruno kind of stuff. That's not brewing. In fact, myself and a few other people like Lucy Cornet and other advocates of homebrewing in South Africa have really taken on the media for reporting it that way, because it's not accurate. But yeah, you are very safe if you use proper brewing practices. Okay, I hope that's answered some of your fears if you had any. So next question, how much dry extract to use per volume for a 20-liter brew? Well, it depends on the beer you make. You know, dry extract's pretty efficient though. So you don't use that much, but for kind of a normal 20-liter brew and a typical ale, you're probably going to be using anywhere from sort of 2 to 3 kilograms of dried malt extract. Okay. If you use lower volumes of brewing, and it's another thing which I also recommend, if you start out small. There's no reason for you to brew 20 liters of beer right away. That's a lot of beer, by the way. It's difficult to find an amount of bottles you'll need to bottle it, and bottling 50 bottles of beer ain't fun. Okay, it's my least favorite part of brewing. I always delay it. Everyone always laughs at me because I really hate bottling. So bottling 20 liters of beer is a bit of a task. Bottling 5 liters of beer, way easier. And if you brew 5 liters of beer, you can use your kitchen. You don't have to go anywhere. You can use a lot of equipment you already have in your kitchen. And 5 liters of beer translates into about an 8-pack of 440 bottles. And that's decent, right? I mean, that's not bad. 8 beers is enough to share with your buddies. And the nice thing is if you brew 5 liters of really bad beer, you don't feel quite as sad when you have to chuck it down the drain as if you did that with 20 liters. Or, you can imagine when commercial brewers screw up and they have to dump thousands of liters. There's a lot of tears in that brewery. So, smaller brewing, not a bad way to start. Next question. If one prefers lower levels of carbonation, does one simply not add the sugar to conditioning? Well, you wouldn't not add sugar at all, because then you risk not carbonating your beer at all. Remember, at the end of fermentation, the yeast has already converted much of the sugar in the beer to alcohol and CO2 and flavor. So there may not be enough left to carbonate your beer. So that's why when home brewers, condition their beer and they bottle it, they add a little bit of extra sugar. And it could be, you can use table sugar, you can use dextrose, there's many different things. You can use malt extract even. You can use honey, anything with sugar in it which can be fermented. And then you cap the beer, and then the CO2 which is produced as a result of that interaction will then dissolve back into the beer because there's nowhere for it to go because you've put a cap on it, and it gets reabsorbed by the beer and that carbonates your beer. So manipulating the levels of carbonation is all about manipulating the amount of sugar you put into that bottle before you cap it. So if you like lower carbonated beer, you'll use less sugar. And also the style of the beer will influence it. Some styles of beer have more residual sugar at the end of fermentation than others. So if you're brewing, for instance, a Belgian beer or an English ale, it will have more sugar left over in the fermentation because of the yeast you're using and because of the processes of brewing that beer. So it will naturally carbonate way more if you then add sugar to it as well. Whereas if you use, if you're brewing a style which has almost no sugar left, you'll need to add a bit more sugar to get to the same carbonation level. There's a science to this, and there are many calculators out there. In fact, we haven't got a calculator for carbonation on the site yet, but now that I'm thinking of it, I should put one up there, which you can use to calculate exactly how much sugar to add to how much volume of beer to produce a certain level of carbonation. Okay. So, and most ales are, sort of in the 2.3 to 2.5 range carbonation. It's 2.3, 2.5 volumes is the measuring unit we use there. But if you find that you like lower carbonated beers, by all means, add less sugar. You can halve the sugar you add, and then, you can experiment with that. You'll still get a carbonated beer, albeit not as carbonated. And that's also why when you bottle beers, by the way, it's useful to mix your sugar into the wort as a whole rather than adding sugar to the bottle itself. It's better to sort of sublimate the sugar into the wort and then bottle it. It's much more accurate, and you can become much more accurate in guessing what carbonation you'll get from that. Okay, another question. When adding yeast, do you stick to a single strain or attempt to? That's a good one. Okay, so I think what you mean here is, can you add different kinds of yeast together? You can, but it's not recommended. Generally, when you add yeast, try and stick to one strain, because some strains can compete against each other, and that can be negative for your flavor of your beer. It may not ferment out completely, or it can produce some pretty weird flavors. Although, having said that, a lot of the yeast strains we use right now in beer were made by combining strains. So, but that's a professional thing to do. Scientists who work with yeast can do that. I wouldn't really recommend doing that with your yeast. One strain is enough, because then you also learn what flavor it produces, right? And then obviously, yes, you can produce different flavors through additives and malts. And that's really the purpose of doing homebrewing, right? Is you can experiment. And that's why it's so much fun to use the methods I spoke of, extract brewing with specialty grains or all grain brewing. It's a kind of a fun which you really can't easily have through just using kit brewing, where those things have already been decided for you. Okay, so I think I've already answered the question around borehole water. Just make sure that if you can, test it. But if you've been drinking it for many, many years, it should be fine. And smell it. I mean, if borehole water smells weird, don't brew with it. Don't drink it. But mostly it should be fine. Another question is, if you add adjuncts, so some of those other ingredients like berries and fruit and spices, does it increase the possibility of contaminating your beer? Absolutely does. That's why you need to treat it very carefully. So for instance, if you're adding wood to your fermenter, so wood staves or wood chips, it's a good idea to sterilize that wood through either soaking it in high percentage alcohol. So some people do that. They'd soak the grain, the wood chips, let's say in vodka for a couple of days, which should kill most of the bacteria. Or an easier way to do that, and less expensive way, why waste good, vodka, is to steam the chips. So just, put them in a colander over boiling water, put some tinfoil over the colander to keep the steam in, and steam them for about 20 minutes. Mostly anything which you boil, the rule of thumb is if you boil something for about 10 to 15 minutes, it is sterile. Okay, so there are no bacteria we know of which can affect beer which will survive a 10-minute or 15-minute boil. So that's always safest. If you're worried about something, you can do that with fruit as well, though that will change the flavor of the fruit, will make it more stewy. So there are different ways of sterilizing adjuncts. Also, the later in the process you add the adjunct, you now have the natural alcohol of the beer in the fermenter, for instance, which can sterilize as well. So that's why when we dry hop, for instance, when we add hops to the fermenter directly, we don't generally sterilize the hops. Hops in itself is slightly antibacterial in nature. So bacteria has a tough time growing on top of hops. But because the alcohol has already been formed in the beer by the time you dry hop, the alcohol in the beer will sterilize as well. Okay, so again, like I said before, beer wants to be made, man. It even produces its own sterilizing agent, alcohol. Okay, what is the ideal pH for the water you use? Well, pH is a pretty complicated subject in and of itself, and you can manipulate the pH through adding acids and so on, alkaline salts to water. Generally, I've found in South Africa that I don't really have a lot of issues with pH in the municipal water or the mineral waters available. And remember that depending on what method you use, if you use all grain brewing, your grains themselves will alter the pH of the water. And so it will often create the correct pH in the water through adding the grains, which again is just amazing. So I've never had to adjust pH level in my brewing. And some of the commercial breweries I've worked with as well have not ever needed to adjust their pH level. It is sometimes necessary, and that could be, and I think someone's just posted their reasons for low mash efficiency, or is that a question? I think that's a question. But as it turns out, pH can affect your mash efficiency, and so on. But mostly I find that if you add the grains to normal water, which you can drink, it actually creates the right pH level. What are the reasons for low mash efficiency? Well, it's often about the methods you use. So if you use brew in the bag, which I am a great advocate for, the mash efficiency is less because you're not sparging, you're not washing the grains as you would with a sort of a more traditional approach. It could be your temperature. Okay, if your temperature is not right, it will not convert as many starches into sugar. So temperature plays a role. Time plays a role. Often I find homebrewers mash too quickly. They want to get it done, so they mash for like 30 minutes or an hour. And one of the easiest ways to improve your mash efficiency is just to mash for longer, right? If you normally mash for 60 minutes, mash for 75. If you normally mash for 75, mash for 90. You will get better efficiency through longer mashing. And then also your recirculation processes will play a role. The slower you recirculate, the better your mash efficiency. If you wash the grains too quickly, you're going to leave a lot of the sugar trapped into the grain bed. That can affect it. So quite a number of things. One thing I wouldn't get too upset about if I'm homebrewer is if I do have low mash efficiency. I'm having trouble pronouncing that word today. It's not a competition, right? No one's going to come and give you an award for, well done. You've done a 90% mash efficiency. If you're a commercial brewer, obviously you are worried about that because you're using tons of grain and you want to get the most out of it because it can, it can really add a lot to your cost. But as a home brewer, who cares, right? You're not using tons of grain. The most important thing in homebrewing is to know what your mash efficiency is. Again, there are calculators which you can use on the internet, or if you use brewing software, can do it for you, because then you can adjust your recipes accordingly. For lower mash efficiency, you'll use more grains, obviously, than for higher ones. But more important is knowing what that is, because then your recipes will work out every time. But it's not a competition. So, I mean, in brew in a bag, the best mash efficiency I've ever attained in brew in a bag methods is around 80%. And that's really hard to get to 80%. Mostly, I adjust my recipes for brew in a bag, for instance, to about 65 to 70%, which is as a commercial brewer, you would probably get fired if you got that sort of mash efficiency. But home brewers, you don't have to worry about that. Hope that's answered your question. Okay, do you have experience adding cannabis? And if so, what advice? I'm not sure if you're asking if I have experience with cannabis. I'm not sure I can answer that. I'm not sure who's attending, if there are any law enforcement here. Yeah, I mean, I've not personally added cannabis. I've tasted quite a few cannabis beers recently since the legalization of it. I'm not a fan. I mean, cannabis is a herb, much like many other things you can add to beer. I don't like the flavor of what it does to beer. It has a bit of a waxy, weird, grassy flavor sometimes. Hops is a much better family member of that particular family to use, really. And you're not really going to get any of the hallucinogenic properties of cannabis coming through in beer. It doesn't work that way. So I don't know. I think it's a bit of a gimmick, to be quite honest with you, because there are so many better things to add to beer, which will make it taste so much better, including hops, right? Of which there are hundreds of varieties. Okay, another question. Looks like the final question, but please do feel free to post more questions on the chat. We still have some time left. What's the best method to perform chilling? Well, in home brewing, there are three main ways you can do it. The simplest way is to put your kettle, your pot, which you've brewed in an ice bath. So again, if you brew smaller quantities, it's easier, because if you're using, let's say, a 9-liter stock pot, if you're brewing sort of small batches of beer, you can easily put that stock pot in the sink, fill it with ice or those blue blocks, and it will really chill your beer out very quickly. You can get about a 20-minute period where you can bring it down to pitching, temperatures. So just for those who don't know, pitching temperature is just when you pitch the yeast. So it's, like I said before, 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. So an ice bath is still, for me, the simplest way. You can obviously make a bigger ice bath by if you're using 20-liter brews, you're not going to put it in your sink because you'll destroy it. You can go and buy yourself one of those big galvanized metal baths next to the side of the road. They're great. You can get a lot of ice in, or, if you don't want to pay for ice, you can make your own by filling a couple of 2-liter cool drink bottles in the freezer and then chucking them in that bath. It's still going to be really, effective. But more efficient ways would be either using a counterflow wort chiller, and that is where you pump water through a pipe within a pipe. So the way it works is the outside pipe has cold water in it, and the inside pipe has your wort through it, and they counterflow, so they flow in opposite directions. And so the cold water basically chills down the wort, carries away the heat. Okay, that's one way. I'm not a fan of those because they're difficult to clean, and I've often found when homebrewers come to me with problems with their beer, it's often as a result of those, because they're not cleaned properly. It's easy to leave substances inside of those counterflow chillers, and you can't open them up, so you don't know. And there's some pretty bad stuff growing in those. My preferred way of doing it, if I'm not using an ice bath, is the immersion wort chiller. So that's usually a series of coils, usually copper or copper coils. You can use stainless steel coils as well, through which you pass very cold water, and you put that whole thing in your wort, in your kettle. It's easy to sterilize. You make sure it's clean, obviously, first, and then you can, in the last few minutes of the boil, you'll put the immersion chiller in the boil to sterilize it, and you just leave it in there. And when you chill, you hook it up to cold water. You can hook it up to tap water, but it's even more effective if you push that water through, let's say, a cooler box with ice in it, and the water goes through the pipes. It doesn't touch the beer, right? It's just the copper loops, and that can chill your beer out very rapidly, very, very, very rapidly. And again, you're trying to aim usually from end of boil to pitching your yeast. Try not to spend longer than half an hour or so. chilling your beer. It has real advantages for clarity and flavor stabilization and less chance of infecting through bacterial growth and so on. So I would always go, if you're not going to use the ice bath, go for an immersion wood chiller. You get plate chillers too, but those are super expensive, and that's what more commercial brewers use. Okay. I really hope that's helped. One more question here. Great. Please keep them coming. We still have a bit of time. If my water does not achieve the target original gravity, can one add DME, and is there a formula to figure out how much to add? Absolutely. I promise I did not pay this person to ask this question. Turns out that we have a calculator on the beginnerbrewer.com site. So if you go to beginnerbrewer.com and you click on calculators in the menu, there is in fact a calculator there which you can use to adjust your OG, your original gravity, by either adding DME if it's lower than expected, or if it's higher than expected, that also happens, you can dilute it with water. And the calculator does both for you. So you just input the numbers and it tells you exactly how much to add, either DME or water, to get to the right target gravity. So thanks for that question. Good one. Good question. What would be the best way to include cold brew coffee into a brew? Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I've done that before. Very good idea, by the way. You can add coffee to the boil itself, but there's always a risk of making it very bitter. So yeah, cold brew coffee is one of the best things. If you want to add coffee to beer, that method is a really good one. But because it's cold brew, obviously you risk contamination. The best thing you can do there is either adding it really kind of quite late in the fermenter when there's already alcohol. So the alcohol in the beer will sterilize it. Or another way, and it's the way I've done it before, is using cold brew coffee, but then adding it the last few minutes of the boil. So it won't necessarily, reduce the sort of smoothness of the coffee, but 5 minutes or so it spends in the boiler will be, enough to sterilize the coffee for use in your beer. So that's usually my way of doing it. But it can have some really good results if you use good coffee, especially. Okay, another question. If I use an urn for the boil, can I pour the wort into another container and then into an ice bath for cooling? And should I do it by using a tap for aerating? Yes, is the answer to that. That was a simple one. Yeah, absolutely. That's probably the only way. You're not going to put the urn into ice, I guess. It will destroy it. So yes, pour the wort into preferably a metal container. Because I wouldn't do plastic that much, because a lot of plastics release harmful, materials when it's heated. So be cautious of that. Most plastics are not designed for, high heat. Obviously there are some, but you can't just sort of use anything because there are some known nasty stuff, carcinogens, which can be released through heating plastic. So be careful of that. So rather put it in a pot or something else. Any kind of aluminum or steel pot or copper pot even, and using the tap will aerate it. So for those of you who are wondering about that, that's kind of the only time in brewing you want to add oxygen to your beer. Any other time during brewing, it's a bad idea. In fact, when you go to any commercial brewery, you'll see all those pipes and stuff. It's all very nicely sealed. It's because commercial brewers fear aeration more than most things, because it really harms the flavor and the flavor stability of beer. But the one time you want to add oxygen is when you just before you add yeast. So when you've chilled your wort, you want to add a lot of oxygen to it. So splashing the wort around is a good idea. Just remember that when you, in this question, when you are splashing the wort while it's still very hot, it isn't able to absorb that much oxygen. Okay, because warmer liquids are not able to absorb as many molecules as colder liquids. So you may still need to aerate it by shaking, your fermenter. So once you've put the wort into the fermenter and you've put the yeast in the fermenter, you can shake it up, right? Just shake it up and add some air into it to make sure that the yeast has enough oxygen, because that's why you do it. Yeast needs oxygen and sugar to live, much like us. Okay. I have another question here. I have a problem with head retention of my beers. I use Irish moss for clarifying. Could that be the reason? I don't think so. Irish moss is a good ingredient to use. You may be using too much. A little goes a long way. So if you're using a 20-liter brew, a teaspoon of Irish moss is more than enough. If you use smaller quantities of brewing, of beer, you can use even less. Head retention can often be a result of the malts you use. A lot of malts are actually negatively correlated with head retention. And another common problem with head retention is oil. So if you're using anything which is oily, That's why nut beers are difficult. Um, because the oils affect the chili, those sort of things can affect it. So any adjunct can often affect head retention. But it's often more to do with the grains you use. There are grains like foam, which you can use, which actually improve head retention. And that's a grain you can buy from homebrew suppliers. If you're using all grain methods, you can use that in your mash. Some small percentage of that will help with head retention. Another thing which can affect head retention is too much protein in your beer. So maybe you're not boiling hot enough, or not long enough. So you're not getting that hot break, which is where the proteins sort of dissolve properly. And maybe you're not chilling quick enough. So that's another part where if you do quick chilling, you get what is called the cold break. And you'll see it's almost like a weird cake of stuff coming out of the beer when you chill it very rapidly. And that's the protein you're actually removing from the beer and hopefully not putting in your fermenter, right? Another thing to do is to whirlpool. So whirlpooling will help make it easier for you to not put all that stuff in the fermenter, which will affect your head retention as well. So there's several steps along the way which you can do to ensure head retention. And by the way, the final one, maybe the first one you should try, is please rinse your glasses. I know it sounds silly. Even if you use a dishwasher, you rinse your glasses before putting beer inside of them. Okay, so rinse them properly, because the residue of soap particles in a glass is actually the main reason why at a restaurant, for instance, when your beer head disappears, it's because they haven't rinsed their glasses properly. And that's why you see those special rinsing machines at a tap sometimes at a restaurant. It's because brewers know that head disappears when it touches soap residue of any kind. So that's one thing to always try, right? Could just be that. Okay, another question. Yes, shaking the fermenter will create oxidization. That's what you want. So you want to create more oxygen in that stage of the process. It's the only stage in the process you want to create oxygen, because the yeast needs it to live. Any other place in brewing, oxygen is not welcome. Okay, so when you're transferring, for instance, your beer from the fermenter to a bottle, when you're bottling your beer, not a good idea to introduce oxygen there. In fact, when people do that, you get an off flavor called oxidization. It makes your beer taste like cardboard or rubber. It's very unpleasant. And if you do taste that in your beer, you'll know, oh, I introduced oxygen probably when I bottled the beer. But when you put it in a fermenter, that's fine. Okay, another one. I rack off my chilled wort into a fermenter by just opening the tap and letting it flow. I then sprinkle the yeast on top once it's all in the fermenter. There are many ways of adding yeast to your wort. My preferred way is to rehydrate. If it's dried yeast, and I suspect that this is, I like rehydrating my dried yeast. There's a lot of debate about whether that's needed. Some of the yeast manufacturers say it's not needed. Some of them do. But experiments I've conducted myself and seen conducted suggest that rehydrating yeast is a very good idea. So rehydrating it before in the process of making the beer, somewhere along the line, rehydrating it for about 20 minutes or so, and then adding that rehydrated liquid into your fermenter is a much better idea, because it gives your yeast just that sort of leg up. You don't have to add it slowly. You can just chuck it right in. Make sure, obviously, the wort is at the right temperature. And make sure that the temperature of the liquid, which you're now putting into the wort, which has the yeast in it, isn't vastly different from the wort. That's why I always measure the temperature of both before I pitch my yeast. And if it's within 5 degrees of each other, I'm happy. But if it's not, that's a problem. So that's why you need to monitor the temperature of your wort as you're chilling it, obviously using a sterilized thermometer, and sterilize it every single time, right? Don't do what some people do, and they measure the temperature, leave the thermometer on the table, and then stick it back in the wort later. That's potential contamination. But if your yeast is within 5 degrees of the wort, it will make it much more likely that yeast will grow quickly. If it's more than 5 degrees of difference, there's something called yeast shock. And so the yeast cells kind of contract very rapidly, and they take a longer time to start activating again. So just beware of that. I know we're all running out of time. Some of you have to go work, and so do I. I can do this all day. This is a great deal of fun. But a few last questions, and then we'll call it quits. I will post a recording of this webinar on Beginner Brewer's YouTube channel, which we've just started recently. So you can go watch that again, and you can tell your friends and homebrew buddies to go watch it, please. Please subscribe. It helps us a lot to keep things going. And go check out the website as well. There's lots and lots of information. I'd love to hear your comments on the articles. You can leave comments, or you can interact with us on the Facebook page, on Twitter as well. But let me quickly answer one last question. What's the best way to go as a first brew after those nasty kids? Okay, so really, they're not nasty. I mean, shame. And, you know, they have a purpose and they get a lot of people into the hobby. I'm not a fan of them. I don't think you learn anything by using them. The best way, and I've recently written about 3 or 4 articles on the website on the quickest way to get started, is by buying some dried malt extract, buying some specialty grains like crystal malt, which the homebrew shop can mill for you. You don't even have to mill it yourself. The nice thing about crystal malts is they're kind of brittle, so you can crush them easily with a rolling pin yourself if you want to do that. And with a few simple procedures and ingredients, starting small, brewing a 5-liter batch of beer with the pots and stuff you have available in your kitchen, and the articles I wrote tell you exactly what you need. But basically, with a few kilograms of dried malt extract, a little bit of specialty grains, a cotton bag, okay, that's pretty much the only technical stuff you're going to need, a good pot, yeast, obviously, which you can get from your homebrew stores, and some hops. And you don't have to buy a lot of hops, because if you make a small batch of beer, you're not going to use a lot of hops. So with those simple ingredients, you can produce really good beer, really good beer. I have a recipe in those articles of an English bitter. It's probably the first beer I brewed. And to this day, I keep repeating that beer recipe because it really works. And so using a simple few ingredients like that, you can produce beer which you will not find in a kit. Promise you that. Once you start doing that and you start boiling your wort and you start adding your own hops and so on, the amount of flavor you get out of that and the amount of control you have over your beer, and just the fun of doing it. I mean, it's just fun, man. I mean, chucking hops into boiling water, nothing better. You won't look back. And you can produce award-winning beer using this method. I have. When I was doing a lot of homebrew competitions many years ago, I used to win awards for beers I brewed this way, and often the judges didn't want to believe that it wasn't an all-grain beer. But you can produce really good beer this way. Okay. I will post a link to my YouTube channel. I'm not very well prepared because I don't have it on me, and I'll have to copy it. But you know, if you go to Facebook, please, on the Beginner Brewer page, I will post it there. So I unfortunately don't have it on me now, and I don't want to leave the screen, but I will do. And yeah, please check it out. I think if you probably won't find it on YouTube if you look for it, because you don't really have any videos yet. But yeah, just check out Facebook for that link. And I think that's all we have time for. Thank you, everybody. I really, really enjoyed this. Thanks for the participation and the questions and everything. I hope this has been useful for you. I hope the sound was okay. And I'm going to post the next webinar soon, a link to it, and please come and attend. It's only going to get better from here on in, and I'll treat each of the subjects I've covered today in far greater detail. So we'll take you through how to brew using extracts, how do you do all grain beer and so forth, and the equipment and all the other things. And if you have any topics you really want me to cover in the next webinar, please do post them on the Facebook page, or direct message me on Facebook, and I'm happy to address those in the next webinar. But I hope it goes well with your brewing. Relax, go brew a beer, and remember, above all, beer wants to be made, okay? It's not complicated. If the ancient Babylonians could do it, you can too. Okay, so thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great Friday. I hope that you have some beer available in this horrible time of prohibition. But fortunately, you're on your way to making your own, which is even better. Thanks a lot, and take care.